You're listening to Invest in the Future by Future Africa, a live fireside chat series where we learn from interesting people doing important work globally.
Thank you, Ory and Patrice, for joining us today. It was very, very difficult to track you both down. We've been at this for a while, but there's no better group to be having the conversation that we're having right now. And we've not met before, Ory, but it was my personal preference that we actually had you here, just knowing a lot about your background and everything you've been able to do, your contributions to the ecosystem. And actually the same goes for Patrice as well, with all the work that you've been doing with AFIG Group. Again, there's no better group to be having this conversation, and I think that there's a lot to learn, certainly from myself. I mean, we've been doing great work at Future Africa, and most of the things that we're trying to do today are really tied to companies being able to understand how corporate governance comes in. I'm not going to make any conclusions up front, but really to understand whether it is a fancy term when they're starting their companies, or it is something that they should be paying attention to right up front. I will introduce myself and then give the panelists also an opportunity to say a little bit. They both don't need introductions, but I think it would be nice to just hear from them, and then we can kick off with a summary and then throw in some of the questions that have come in from the audience before the call. So my introduction will be the shortest. My name is Mayowa, and I'm the CFO at Future Africa. My background has been in finance all my life. So typically in a room like this, I will be the most boring person because all I know is the numbers. And it's very clear given the lineup that we have here today. Prior to now, I led finance at a company called Flutterwave, which is a firm that we may all be familiar with. I was actually one of the first 8 to 10 employees at the company. We had a little office at the time, and the company is well known now for all the impact and contribution that it has made to the innovation ecosystem in Africa. Very proud to have been part of that. Obviously with E, who is the CEO at Future Africa as well. Prior to that, I was also in investment banking, tax and consulting, and the whole shebang. So I'm going to stop there with that brief intro and quickly turn the mic over to Ory, who needs no introduction, obviously, to say a few things about herself. I mean, we'd love to get to know her more than the stuff that we see and the references that we see in books and articles, etc. Get to know her more on a more personal level, and then we can take the conversation further. Ory, mic is going to you now. Really love to learn a little bit about you.
Thanks, Mayo. I'll keep it quite brief so that we get to what I'm sure will be a great conversation. Hi, everyone. I'm Ory Okolloh, joining this session from Nairobi. I'm based in Nairobi. Currently, I'm a partner at Verod-Kepple Africa Ventures. It's a new fund that's a joint venture between Verod, which many people might know as a top PE shop in West Africa, and Keppel Africa, which is very active as a pre-seed and seed investor. They've come together and now joined Rio and Satoshi as a partner, and we'll be focusing on providing growth capital. So Series A Plus is our sweet spot, although we can go in a bit earlier to companies across Pan-Africa, tech-enabled, sector agnostic. And you can find out more about us online. Prior to this, I've had a very long history in the tech space, even before mobile phones were a thing, when we were still trying to lay fiber, in different roles as an entrepreneur, as an operator. That was the first head of policy and strategy for Google in Africa and built up a team, and also led their GovRail work. So I have a lot of regulatory experience. Then I was an impact investor with a media network, writing checks before there was anything like a VC ecosystem. So there's only patient capital and impact capital then. And now with VCAF, I also sit on a couple of boards, both globally and regionally, including Deloitte Africa, East African Bureaus, and I chair the Stanbic Foundation in Kenya. And over to you, Patrice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Patrice Backer. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of AFIG Funds. We're a private equity fund manager investing in Africa since 2006. We currently manage about $260 million, and we're really focused on adding value to our investee companies, strengthening them beyond the capital we bring, in order for them to be regional blue chips. And certainly our ultimate objective is to strengthen the African private sector, because we believe that there is no better way to do this and to reach maximum impact than to make sure that our investments strengthen and create stronger companies. Before that, I worked on Wall Street for a number of years and worked with my partner. So we go back a long way. We go back more than 30 years now. Papan Ndiaye, who's the partner, founder, and chief executive officer of AFIG Funds.
Absolutely brilliant. And thank you so much, Patrice. Thank you so much, Ory. I mean, I just needed that to go out very quickly so that I can prove my statements right. But I mean, there's no better group to be having this conversation with. The conversation specifically is around corporate governance in startups and whether they should be thinking about it now or later. I'll read out a brief summary and then we can move very quickly to what the agenda looks like. When we're discussing corporate strategy in Africa, one crucial concern is whether to get serious about it at the early stages of a startup or later when the company is in functional mode. It's common to invest more in it at the growth stage, since at the early stage, the desire is really the liberty of innovating and experimenting without any hindrance of traditional sets of rules, etc. Now, many experts have tried to infer that a balance needs to be struck. Many other experienced professionals believe that the actual role of corporate governance begins when the startup is far ahead of the idea stage and has entered into a more accountable phase. And so in this webinar, what we want to do is unpack these expert perspectives in the following, in the key areas that we'll be getting into right now. And the idea will be, whether we should think about it now or later, what the definition of scope of it needs to be, what boards need to look like, what mistakes can people avoid, what does dispute resolution look like on a high level, and what kind of resources founders and company promoters can look into in order to really put themselves on solid footing to be able to, get the best out of what corporate governance should be for their firms. Right. So I will start with one of the questions the core question that has come from the audience and just the thinking around this idea. And the format we will use is that we will just take one question and we get perspectives from the panelists as we go, because what we want to do is really enrich our views in some of these key pillars or areas around how we should be thinking about corporate governance in young companies around Africa, right? Especially given the backdrop of some of the scandals that have been airing in the past 12 months, etc., and how much could corporate governance have really helped these instances in such a way that, these things wouldn't have come to light or they wouldn't even exist. So I'll start with the first question of now or later. The question will be, should startups spend time on corporate governance right now or later in their growth life cycle? And I'll just let Ory take the first stab at that and hear your views.
Sure. And maybe I want to first borrow from a bit of what Patrice has said. I think overall, many of us who are in this space, and it's one of the things we're trying to do at VCAV, are quite keen and concerned to see that we have blue chips, startups that are around for, not startups anymore, proper companies that are around forever that can expand even globally. And I think you're seeing that we spend so much time at the early stage offering advice, support, and pre-seed and incubators and all sorts of things. And as the companies start growing, there's not that kind of support and resources that they need. So I think the corporate governance conversation is quite timely as we start to grow up as a market and an ecosystem. So I'll start with a few things, and actually wrote down notes so I don't rumble too much. So excuse me if it sounds a bit sort of stilted. But the starting point for me would be first, what do we mean when we say corporate governance, right? So it's not just about boards, because that's the first thing, gosh, do I need a board? No, corporate governance is not just about boards. It's really about a set of management processes and practices that determine how your company will be run. So it's important to have first a wider lens of what we mean when we talk about corporate governance. And that can be anything from financial controls, it can be disclosures, ethical conduct, do you have a code of conduct, risk management, are you thinking about impact, regulatory compliance, and so on. And what you're really trying to do is, in an ideal state, get to a stage where even you as a founder can sort of step away for a week and checks can be signed and things can be, things can run in an ideal state without everyone calling you just as a CEO to approve every little thing, right? It can be as simple as that. And it should not just be a tick box exercise to say, okay, gosh, I'm seed stage is now, do I get a board now? I'm Series A, do I get whatever? It really comes down to a culture as well. Like, what kind of culture do you want to build, as a founder or for your company, that is really will set you up to succeed in the long run. So with all this being said, you can see that the right time to start is like yesterday, right? So even if you're a sort of small little early on, maybe it's an advisory board, or it's thinking about, okay, what are some of the roles, start to think about JDs at some stage, or start to think about IP agreements, and then you stagger it, and we can go into that. How do you then stagger the evolution of it? So, my short answer is almost immediately, maybe past product market fit, and you're starting to kind of grow the company, is the right time to start.
Absolutely. We'll dig into some details, because on the surface, what you've just described actually sounds like a lot. And then the founder asks himself, how the hell do I think about this upfront, since Ory is telling me to start right now? But I guess we'll come back to that. I mean, Patrice, we'd love to hear what you think about and in your experience, given all the support you give to companies.
Sure. I think it's never too early to start thinking about corporate governance. As Ory just presented, corporate governance is really a set of rules, practices, and procedures that basically allow a firm to be governed and controlled. At the end of the day, that's what it is. And what corporate governance aims to achieve is to balance out the interests of the investors, of management, of customers, of the government. And by government, I mean regulators, because, we need to think about them. And, in some industries, you may have other stakeholders or communities that you need to take into account. And so, you might think, and I think Ory said it just right. When you start thinking about corporate governance, most people will think board committees, board politics, control and things of the sort. But we at AFIG Funds, we've looked at the universe of investments we've made, and we've drawn lessons from it. And if you now apply it to the early stage world, we view the world, companies in 4 different categories. And each category has an appropriate set of governance that needs to apply. And I'll give you an example. When you're looking at, 2 or 3 people gathering to, they have an idea, they want to launch a company. The company is not even formed yet, right? So, this is the ideation stage. You're just thinking about it, but you think you have something. One could say, well, you don't need to think about governance. And we think that you start need governance right then and there. You need to think about, okay, how much am I going to contribute? What equity interest am I going to have? What if someone decides after 6 months, this is not the life for them? How do they depart? Right? And you bring all these issues into a document that may be 2, 3, 4 pages. Typically it's called the founder's agreement. That is governance. And that's why, and then we go on down the line, and, our world is growth equity, but, if we were to map it to the early stage world, our categories are, as I said, basically pre-seed. Then you are at a stage where you need to validate your concept, so minimal viable product. Then you need to start thinking about you're getting traction. Then it's all about, product market fit. And then it's the growth stage. And for each of these categories, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but we have basically a playbook for governance because it's essential for companies. So short answer is it's never too early to start thinking about governance.
Absolutely. So I'll tell you what I really love. We deliberately didn't start with the definition because we didn't want to help anybody bust the thinking, and we dove straight into thinking about how should founders be thinking about this upfront. And I think these submissions have been really awesome and really helped us move into how we should define the scope of this. I think the key most founders will agree that at some point they need to be thinking about corporate governance. But also, I mean, I hear from the two submissions that there's a lot of emphasis on board, and it seems to be a synonym with corporate governance, which is not really the correct thing, right? And so the idea will be most founders would agree that at some point they should pursue the establishment of proper governance and controls, etc. I think the first question I would love you to answer, which really follows from your earlier submission, Patrice, is, I mean, it's very clear that they should think about it from almost day one, but how should they think about it in various phases? And is there a template idea for founders to follow, or does it depend on the kind of business that they're operating, what kind of regulatory space they're operating in, or what kind of business it is they're doing, or industry, or etc., or how many people are involved? What kinds of heuristics do you feel like founders need to take into account depending on what stage they're in? Now that we've established that from day one, they should be thinking about it, and how does this evolve over time?
As I said, we've thought about it, and we actually have something much more detailed. I see some questions about that, but really you have to look at governance through 4 different lenses. The first one is basically strategy and partnership. And that, happens very early on. So from the time, the 2 or 3 people get together, you already have to start thinking about it. And it builds over, as you grow, as you go from one category to the next, leading up to the formation of fairly complex boards. Boards usually come around category 3, sometimes now maybe category 2, but that's the first lens you have to look at. The second is people and resources. When you just started, it's you and your co-founder. You guys are across the desk from each other. You're not really thinking about, how do I manage people? But the minute you start recruiting, it's a whole different ballgame. And Mayowa, you know that very well. Ory, you've been through it probably several times. And so that's the second lens that, again, grows over time. But it's not an emphasis until a little bit later. The third category is basically intellectual property and tech. There is governance around that as well. If someone comes in with a patent, for example, and that's the extreme case, and they leave, who owns this patent? If they came with it, maybe it's theirs. If it was developed by them while they were in the company, who owns it? So you need to think about those issues. And then from the tech perspective, it's more of a risk perspective. It's, how do we protect ourselves? Cybersecurity has to be number one, one of the number one priorities for a lot of people because of what we're seeing today, ransomware and all of these things. That's another matter of governance. It's not a tech issue. It's a board issue, and it's a governance issue. And last but not least is process and accountability. That's the fourth lens. And this is where, you start thinking about, internal controls, making sure that you're not being ripped off by some accountant somewhere. You think about all the ways you need to, the policies you need to implement to protect the company, and making sure, if there's an issue, who is responsible for it and how it's going to be fixed. So in terms of your question, that's how we look at things in terms of governance at every single stage. And it builds on each other so that, by the time you reach the growth stage, hopefully you will have done as much of the work as possible to have a best of class governance structure. It doesn't have to be complex, but it has to be well thought out.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think, it really follows your earlier submission that it appears that there are many moving parts and people need to be considerate of where exactly they are playing. Hearing that if you're a software-heavy company, you're probably angling to ensure that all your intellectual property is protected, regardless of who comes or who leaves and etc. Ory, for you, I'm interested to hear your take because I know you're operating now with relatively clean hands, but at some point your hands were very dirty in this particular piece, right? Particularly kind of starting up companies that were not exactly I would say professional or like finance or like heavy technical thing. It was more building solutions that there was no template for, right? And most of the founders that we really love in this space are doing the exact same thing. When they come in, there's no template to follow. There's nobody to copy, except in some cases, some American company who's doing something similar. So I'm interested to hear how your thinking has evolved around this. What did you see at that point? What was prioritized? What worked? And what do you think, should have been at the time?
Yeah, so first I'd say actually, some of these questions were framed like within the African context, but honestly, I think it doesn't matter, and even across sector, other than maybe, as Patrice said, maybe in some cases you might need a patent and all of that, but really, I think it applies across. But what tends to happen, the startup, and I've been guilty of this myself in organizations I've been involved with. You start your building, it's exciting, as you said, you're across the desk, it's all hands on deck, no roles, we're all flats, whatever, and we Slack each other. Okay, we didn't have Slack, whatever the equivalent was back then. And, it feels nice and it's exciting and there's no boss and, all of that, right? And the challenge, it's fine. I mean, this probably is a pre-seed, I guess, equivalent. So that energy, you kind of, and then this is the reluctance sometimes when you hear corporate governance, you're like, oh gosh, we don't want to be a corporate, or, this is why we're in startups, or this is why I quit McKinsey or whatever to come do this. so there's almost an allergy that you feel, gosh, that's why this question of how long can we get away with being sort of this loosey-goosey operation, exciting, and, no roles, and everyone does, just chips in. That's fine, I guess, to get you maybe product market fit immediately. And then another way to think about this, especially when you're going to market to raise money, if you reverse the role, would you give money to a company that kind of basically has no guardrails, right? Doesn't have financial controls. It's unclear who does what. If someone leaves, no one knows what they were doing as the product dev. It's all in their head. So especially the custodian of investors' money or angels or whoever, you have to ask yourself, maybe to flip it that way, that would you feel comfortable giving another company money if there was kind of no basic processes in place? So in the early, once you get through that exciting thing, what tends to happen? Let's say you raise a bit of money, as you said, you've hired now, and immediately you'll start to see friction because you hadn't, defined the roles. So the COO is like, why are you in my space? The CEO is, all, even as co-founders or the next level of management, that fuzziness. Someone leaves, someone decides, it's like, as Patrice articulated, there's no clear path, not defined what the equity was, maybe they're going to leave and start trashing you online, all sorts of things. So this is corporate governance. And I think the reality is once the excitement fades, you very quickly move on to the complexity of human beings, of relationships, of the business as it grows. And so I think if you strip away all the technical stuff, like this stage, should you have this, should you have that, and just think about the nature and the complexity of human relationships and of building organizations, maybe that's a better way to think about it. Structure and processes begin to happen. And immediately, once you get to sales, again, you're like, great revenue is coming in. But then you find you've not sat down as a team to think about the big picture, regularly. Like, okay, what's the strategy going forward? So again, maybe this is when the advisory board comes in. Who's there to kind of check you on a few things? Who's there to give you guidance? It's not just about oversight, it's about help, right? And so that's the next stage. You're selling, it's exciting, and then you're stuck. And because you haven't sat down to think about strategy, to think about regulatory, or maybe that's the time the regulator is like, hey guys, what exactly is this you're doing again? So, that's kind of the next stage. And then maybe finally, and then later on at the end, I can share in the chat box sort of different places. The templates are kind of the easier thing to do. It's really putting yourself in that mindset and setting up that culture where these things become very important to you. And as you grow and you get to growth stage, and then that's really about investors. It's really you're bringing in institutional investors. Maybe at one point you're thinking about what exit looks like, and that's when it gets super technical. So that's how I see it. But I hope, for me, lessons learned were that the excitement only takes you so far. And if I look at the organizations that I've been with, or founded or co-founded, or I'm still involved with from even 15 years ago, Mzalendo is one of them, a nonprofit. Honestly, there we skated on being very loose for a long time. And I can see the difference in growth and fundraising in teams and who are able to recruit now once we got very serious about corporate governance. And it will probably be around for another 30 years, right? Because we've now set up a brand. It can move, I don't have to be anywhere near it with my co-founder. We've now on our second CEO. And that's kind of what I'd love to see in the startup space, where companies are around for 50 years, they're proper brands, they're listed, and they've outgrown kind of the co-founders. Sorry, I talked too much, but
no. Actually, we do appreciate those views. And for me, one of my favorite things is really kind of hearing from like where the hands were dirty, right? And I think this is an excellent group to be having this conversation with. Cool that our next question actually, it rides off this a little bit, right? Which is really saying, okay, you both invest at various stages, or actually very similar stages in the life cycle of companies. At the stages at which you invest, what's non-negotiable, right? I think what we've heard now is that there's moving parts. It should be customized, etc. At the level at which you invest, and say, if you can think maybe a level lower, say pre-seed and seed, what do you feel like are the things that are non-negotiable at the point? It will probably be a few things or even more.
I would say, first and foremost, a commitment to implementing good governance practices is non-negotiable. If we don't have this commitment, then we're very uncomfortable. And to do that, I think, what we do at AFIG Funds is to basically talk to the target companies or the companies we're thinking about investing in, and stressing that it's not just about money, but it's about how they structure themselves so that we can become a good partner, have a common understanding of where we're going, and what is the forum where we're going to have our discussions, maybe disagreements, but agree that that forum is going to have rules around it. And in most cases, it's the board. In order for us to do that, and that's non-negotiable, we have put together a rule book for our portfolio companies that, if they don't have it yet, we expect them to adopt it. If we have a minute, I can, share very quickly or just show you a couple of slides we have. But we basically walk them through how to create a board, what you should think about when it comes to composition of the board. What are the committees? You don't always need committees, but once you get to that stage, what are the different committees? What is the emphasis? And then we go down so far as to define or help them structure the board pack, because that's another essential element of a board meeting. Minute taking, what is critical? All of these things we think are important. And if they're not there yet, we understand, but we expect them while we're an investor and sooner rather than later to get there, because we believe that by laying down this common commitment to governance, we can help the business plan be achieved, and it's a win-win situation, for us. So I don't know if I can just, it's literally take me 30 seconds, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, we would love to learn.
I just wanted to kind of show you what we do with our companies, because the point I want to make is we're not in an adversarial situation. What we want to do is accelerate, basically the development of our companies. So if we have information and knowledge that we can share about governance, that's absolutely what we try to do. And it's distilled. This is just one of the documents. Unfortunately, I don't think I can access the share screen, but let's move on, and maybe during the Q&A, I'll be able to do that.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Patrice. So, Ory, what's non-negotiable for you at the stages where you invest?
I think I won't repeat what Patrice said. It's pretty much similar. I think one is that commitment to a culture of good governance. And again, it would vary by stage, but we would look at what are the existing controls. There are certain things we pay attention to, particularly around people. Are there certain handbooks in place? Or if not, is there an intent? Do you watch and pay attention to how you manage people? So there's an HR component that's not just about the law, but also about the culture and the team. In some cases, if you have an advisory board, that's fine, but we'll then look at how do you actually engage with it? Because there are a lot of very super hitter advisory decks, boards that are deck only boards, so do you meet? Do they support? I mean, there's a whole checklist that we go through. And you don't have to necessarily have those things because that's our model. That's why we have a PE partner that brings some of that governance and operational expertise that is available to our portfolio. So if you're not even quite there, would be then looking for the steps that are needed to get you there, and how we can help you get you there in terms of corporate governance. So for, really the starting point is this something you're open to? Is this something that's important to you? And attitude, and then we move from there.
Absolutely. It sounds
the rest
amazing.
Is the same. There's no shift.
I mean, I'm really happy to hear that. I mean, the consistency. The cool thing also that I'm hearing is that at this point, the mention of boards are coming up a lot, right? Unlike when we first started the conversation. So moving to that aspect of this, at the early stage of a company, how specifically should founders think about boards in terms of composition? And maybe we can throw in the diversity aspect of it as well and how they must be accounting for that at the early stages.
So maybe let me take the diversity one first. Again, there's a tendency to sort of sometimes treat this as a checkbox exercise, women, okay, race, whatever. But early on, what you're really looking for, especially when you have kind of a small board, is a diversity of experiences and backgrounds, right? So you don't want to have kind of group thinking or stack your board of advisors with your best buddies who will not check you, and so on. So thinking about one, diverse backgrounds and experiences, in addition to all the other factors, perhaps gender and so on. And I think really making sure that your board members, whether it's advisory or fiduciary board, is aligned with your interests. So I think that's the company's interests, rather, not yours. So maybe that will be my sort of line there. What you tend to see happening in terms of size, so maybe at a pre-seed, you start off with an advisory board, and the difference between an advisory board and sort of a more formal board is really the fiduciary duties that the directors have. And generally, by the time you're getting to Series A, your investors will now insist on a more formal board, right? And again, there's a tendency to kind of stick with an advisory board that was very useful early on, but you can outgrow your advisory board, right? And what the advisory board does is really give input on strategy, help you maybe with networks, help you with fundraising, and starts to sort of help you navigate conflict. Sometimes it's good to have an external sort of point of view and so on. At seed stage, normally the board size is about, you might have an investor there, yourself as a CEO, an independent, or maybe two co-founders and invest in independent. Typical size is 3 to 5. You always want a size that can be where there's a tiebreaker, so 3, 5, 7. So never make the mistake of 4, 6, where there's a split. You always kind of want to have a tiebreaker. And I say really, for me, my observation, big boards, small boards, nonprofits, listed, what you really want to spend time thinking about is who the chair of the board is. So critical because they shape the agenda, help run the meetings well, be a good sounding board. I think especially once you get to growth stage and either, they're starting to think about acquisitions or being acquired or listing or bigger fundraising, having the right chair is critical. I think also as many folks treat boards as a very mechanical exercise. Okay, I have a financial person. The chemistry is quite important. Kind of want your board members to like each other. It's so again, thinking about how they get together, how they engage, and in-person meetings are important. And maybe I think beyond the composition, you really want to start to think about what role you'd like them to play. And typically it's strategy. They're not supposed to be in your day-to-day management. It's risk. They're supposed to, sort of give an overview, help check and make sure that you have the right frameworks in place, help recruiting, help with fundraising. So maybe starting off with mapping what you'd like to get out from a board is important. And I'm sure Patrice has many other useful sort of points to think about.
So the only thing I learned, Ory, is that we need a full session on the composition and on the diversity aspect. I do have some questions, but I would love to hear Patrice's view first.
No, I think Ory covered most of it. And I'll start with the chair. It's crucial. If you have a good chair, I think you can have comfort because the chairperson not only basically manages the board, but has the relationship or should develop the relationship with the CEO and can serve as an arbiter, in case of disagreements. It's crucial. If you have a bad chair, you will feel it as well. In terms of diversity, the way we look at it is the company has opportunities and risks, and therefore you need to have members that have experience in what you've identified as opportunities and risks. On the risk side, if you're heavily regulated, you want someone with regulatory experience. Corporate strategy, people who've run companies before, developed companies before. So you have to think about the diversity of your board in that sense. And obviously someone with the knowledge of the industry definitely helps. The other thing is, you can read diversity that way, which I think is absolutely crucial, or you can read diversity the way we're talking about it more and more, which is, do you have the right men-women balance, or do you think about it? We do. We think about it. And we believe it's not just a question of being, corporate, it's not just about, corporate responsibility. It's not just being about, in doing what is being done these days. It's really about making sure that you have the best talent available. People tend to say, well, if you're thinking about diversity, you're not hiring the best people. That's not true. I chair the governance and nominations committee of a bank we've invested in. The outgoing MD was a woman. The incoming MD was a woman, and she was the most qualified, period. And if we had said, we kind of like guys better, it's a rough and tumble world, then all of a sudden 50% of the potential pool of talented people we throw out the window. So I think, you also need to think about that as you are looking at the composition of your board. And in some industries, like fast-moving consumer goods, I would say, if you don't have women on your board, you're in trouble because they will probably have much more experience than most of the guys around, when it comes to the industry. Just from their daily experience. So I think, when you think about boards, that's that. And then at a later stage, you have to start thinking about committees. And then that's where you start identifying independent board members. That's another aspect of board composition that we don't talk about much. But at some point, you want someone, at least one member, who's not a shareholder, doesn't have a stake or is not linked in some way. So that person can bring a truly objective view. And you have no idea how much that can, change a conversation because we still may suffer from groupthink. And I think Ory alluded to that early on. And it's absolutely important to have this objectivity coming from at least one or two board members. I could spend hours talking about it. My colleagues could spend hours talking about it. But at least we're trying to distill it in something that is practical, that the participants on this call, is something that they can take with them.
Yeah, it's so amazing. As builders ourselves, these are the things that we face every day. Some you face today, some you're facing, some you see of the founders you invest in face today. I did get one. One of the questions I had, Ory, when you were speaking, was really digging deep into this composition pattern. And there was a word you mentioned called interests, which I think Patrice elaborated on in terms of really. Because when there's alignment of interest, it means that, the idea that Patrice said around the alignment with your opportunities and threats, you're really wanting a composition of people who see and have experience with the opportunities and threats that you have as a firm and can actually advise you accordingly as opposed to your friends or etc. So I think that's a massive one. And it helps us to really extricate ourselves from this idea about hey, there's a tick box to how many women or how many men must be on the team. Because, if you're dealing with a a jeans consumer brand who's selling jeans to male and female, right? It just makes sense to be able to represent your customers' interests somehow on the board, or the points of view on the opportunities and threats. So you don't have all men and you're selling women jeans, or you don't have all women and you're selling men's jeans, or things like that. So that alignment, I think, is the most incredible tip that I've gotten from this particular question. It's informing me that this needs to be a series, because I don't think that we can learn everything today. Now we're at, so Ory, please stop us when we're getting over time. Like, I think we can keep going. We've not even touched on most of the questions that we have already, but maybe the last question, and then we go to some of the Q&A, right? And it will be around some of the biggest mistakes that you've seen founders make, given your involvement in the ecosystem today. I mean, we don't need to call any names or whatever, but we're observing a lot of things going on in the ecosystem that are easily avoidable with the right controls in place, or with the right thinking about governance, maybe even not as elaborate as having, a full-fledged $1 million type investment in corporate governance, but really this could have been managed better by having XYZ in place. What do you see today, actually, as the current trend in terms of mistakes that founders are still making, building companies without paying attention to corporate governance? All right, I'll start with you.
Maybe 2 or 3, perhaps waiting too long to start. So waiting until it's a crisis or a headline, or not setting up with the right culture. So again, I think you tend to see this being, the investors want a board, so saying I should do this. I was in this webinar and they said I should start yesterday. So it really goes back to internalizing and really deciding what values you want as a founder or co-founder or leader of an organization. So I think that's a big mistake, sort of treating it as just a headache that, you'll get to eventually. To the extent when things start to come up, letting them fester. They're not going to go away. And so I think just being more proactive with engaging with some of those challenges is not easy. But whether it's your regulator, whether it's your employees, whether you're starting to have people issues, again, not letting things fester. And then I guess the third, once you do all this board composition, you've checked all the things, whatever, you're not actually using your board and engaging with them and really having them be a critical part of your company's success. But I wouldn't say there's anything particularly like in Africa that we're worse off than anybody else, or these are just normal growing pains. And I think it's good, and it's great to see more conversations happen around why this is so important.
I think.
Thank you so much, Patrice.
Yeah, I was going to make some of these points. Maybe a couple more mistakes certainly that we've seen is not spending the right amount on legal advice ahead of time. I think as much as people have an ambivalent relationship with lawyers, it is important to have a budget for legal advice on the documents that you're preparing regarding partnership. Anything that has to do with contractual agreements, make sure to have someone look them over, because you may make a mistake there that you'll pay dearly for later on if you think you know everything and you draft your documents yourself. I know it may sound weird, or to some, they may think, well, I don't have that much money. I have to prioritize. I want to develop my product. Do spend a little bit of time with a lawyer, maybe, a friend, but I say pay for the advice. That I think is number one. The mistake that I have seen, because we've lived it, when we make an investment, there are times when the shareholders are members of the board and they're also executives. You have to have enough self-awareness to start dissociating you as an investor from you as a manager. It's difficult, and I'm fully cognizant of that, but it's absolutely important, because otherwise, when you have an external investor coming in and you're speaking as the executive or the senior manager or the CEO, sometimes we're not sure which hat you're wearing. And sometimes there are conflict. Conflict management is going to be rife in any situation where you have a founder that, did everything, or co-founders that have done everything. Then they get on the board, and not, it's human nature. they're still protecting their own interests, but then the company's interests may be divergent at that point. We've seen cases of founders being kicked off boards, rightly or wrongly, but usually that's when a conflict like that happened. Steve Jobs got kicked off his board. You can read it in the papers. This is a governance crisis that often stems from that type of situation.
Super interesting, Patrice. This stuff happens at the level of the board. I'll throw in a little bit of, a deeper dive into that particular piece at the board level, right? We talked about the composition already and the diversity, but we also see a lot of mistakes happening in boards, rightly or wrongly because of the selection initially, or maybe some of the practices that invariably became rife within the board. So for example, you have a board of 5, but there's like 3 always attending parties together, right? So ultimately, every time there's a decision to be made, there's always going to be an issue with like 2 others. And then these practices where the board actually does not have the capacity to operate efficiently and always has this weirdness going on around it. So within the boards themselves, what kinds of practices have you seen to be great? And what kinds of practices have you seen to be detrimental to an efficient board? Ory, I'll start with you.
I think we've talked about the chair. That's critical. There are tons of templates online actually on running effective meetings and things like that for startups specifically. That would be quite useful. I'll try and see if I can find a few to share. But I think preparation, right? And, for me, a red flag, whether it's a startup or a big board, is when the management bombards you with so much information and then, like, oh, now we have 10 minutes for, I would like you to vote on this, so that you just know that something fishy is going on there. So I think preparing, the chair should help then guide you on what the agenda will be, being quite clear, what's FYI versus where you need decisions. I think a balance, especially now with doing sort of a hybrid, finding time for in-person and building that board chemistry is important. And I think, again, coming back to starting off with what sort of opportunities and risks, as Patrice has highlighted, you start off with, and making sure that you're getting that feedback and input out of your board is important. Of course, with listed companies, bigger companies, it's quite clear the board is there to protect shareholder interests. With startups, there's the VCs, there's you co-founders, management. Sometimes they're wearing a dual hat. So it's messy, right? So someone asked this in chat, like, so how do you balance all this? And there's no. It's always a fine dance, right? There's folks who are pushing for higher valuation. That's their interest in the board. And I think you having a clear sense, especially as founders, is quite important in terms of what you help to get out of it. And then again, I'll go back to a strong chair that helps navigate some of these tensions that will arise is important. And I think for board members themselves, perhaps we should do a session for startup board members to remember that, what your role is. I think we see a lot of corporate governance for board members on big companies and maybe not enough guidance as well. If you've joined a startup board member, how you should conduct yourself and how you should make sure that you're balancing all these different interests.
Absolutely. We will consider that, by the way. Patrice, love to hear your views on great and poor board practices. I was giving some context earlier that we've seen. Obviously, we also invest in a ton of companies, very, very early stage. We've seen boards are not the most important thing at the point, but we've also seen situations where, sometimes it's not really gone well, despite the fact that these folks prioritize having a board, advisory, and for a variety of reasons, right? For example, I was mentioning earlier where, it's a board of 5, but there's actually 3 or 4 where decisions may already be made, like in somebody's house or something, and then at the board meetings, they're just like formalities and things like that. And then it creates a lot of conflict with like the founders. They're unable to get anything done. The board is generally not efficient and is not making decisions objectively and etc. We've also seen situations where, the boards have been very, very efficient. So interesting to learn how you've experienced that for the companies who have actually compose boards? What do you see as the best practices for those ones? And what do you see? I mean, what kind of trends do you feel like boards sometimes get into that are not efficient, not just from what the founder does, but from how the board conducts itself?
Okay. First, in terms of, we've said it, Ory and I said it, and I'll say it again. Make sure you pick the right chair. Okay. All right. I'll put it to rest now, but you cannot imagine how important that is because it actually sets the stage and sets the tone for board meetings and for how they're run. Because, everyone's going to try to pull the rug on their side. Management is going to bombard you with information. The chair has to be able to cut through the thick, board pack and figure out, maybe that's not how we want the board pack to look like, for example, and can order management to rethink it or slim it down, send an executive summary, and then things of the sort. What not to do, don't stack the board with your friends. I've seen some of these instances. In our case, because of the type of companies we deal with, it's family, family businesses. And family businesses may have been around for 10, 20 years, but they may be, very stunted from the standpoint of corporate governance because they've never had to really do it. Usually it's the patriarch or the matriarch, sitting at their breakfast table deciding what's going to happen, and then they impose it on the rest of the company. It's no different from, the co-founders making a decision and basically imposing it on the company. So I think, again, you need to really think about the composition and what ultimately drives value for you. It's the advice, understanding and managing risks and confronting crisis situations. So, pick people who can, really help in specific areas, not your friends, because at the end of the day, that's not what's going to help you. If you have very active investors who are going to, and probably have more experience than you have running boards or sitting in boards, and may make your life very difficult if you're not doing the proper things. The last point about boards is discipline. I think, and discipline has several components to it. One, it's making sure that you have a relevant agenda, and that's usually between management and the chair. So that if you are a founder and you're not the chair, you want to make sure that issues that are important for strategy are brought up and have sufficient time. So, agenda setting for a board meeting is actually important. You don't meet every day, and you want to make the most of it. And the other discipline you want to have, and I think it works well, is when you have regularly scheduled meetings. In our world, it's literally quarterly at the very least. It may be more often if you're a younger company with, growing fast and things move quickly, maybe, monthly or every other month. So those are the recommendations I would make, right off the cuff, but, there are standards that one can apply, but certainly the chair, the discipline, and the composition, again, will make or break you. That's how I see it.
Absolutely critical views. So the questions we're getting are the most interesting ones. I mean, there's one that came up now that I think we only touched on earlier, but I think it's very important, especially for the founders on the group, because one of the reasons that they don't consider corporate governance is not because they are oblivious of it, it's because they may sense tensions between some of the momentum that they are trying to push and how fast the company needs to grow and how quickly decisions need to be made, and the potential for some friction with governance. And they will be imagining boards at this point, but also documentation, approvals, and things like that. How exactly can you manage these tensions, and how should you cap that ambition against the potential risks that come with not having governance as a core focus of your company? Patrice, I love your views on this first. Okay.
I was a little bit stumped by the premise of the question, because if I'm investing in a group, in founders, it's because I may have views on what they're doing, but I fundamentally trust that they are the best people to execute the view, and we bought into it. So the business plan is something that we and they agree upon. So we try as much as possible not to get involved in the day-to-day. So there are many decisions that should not actually be board decisions. I think, we trust management, and management is out to execute, and then management comes and report. And then they can ask, for advice on, okay, we did this, it didn't work out, what happened. I think, if you are growing really fast, where your board is important is when you have significant strategic decisions to make. If, for example, you decide to pivot, that may not be what the investors originally bought into. They need to know, and they need to be able to weigh in. So I believe that in this particular instance, it's important to know what is the mandate of the board, what are the decisions that the board keeps for itself, because it is the apex structure in a company, and what are the decisions that are management and management alone, and management will be assessed on how well they've executed on that, right? If you have to call your board every time you have to make a routine decision, then this is no longer a board. This is an executive committee, and it's a completely different ballgame.
Absolutely straight to the point. Ory, do you have any views to append to that?
Sure. I know we're over time. I think there's a saying, an ideal board is noses in, hands off. So that, if you compose it well, and there will be tensions occasionally, but it shouldn't, inhibit the growth and the day-to-day and the dynamism of the founder or the company. But you also want to make sure that you're not moving so fast and sort of a move fast, break things until you break things fundamentally, right? So you can break things until the company dies. So especially if you're thinking long term, and again, maybe Ian missed this in the beginning. Corporate governance is not just about boards; it's a whole suite of things that you can stagger and make sure. Early on, it's a bit, you're focused on sort of getting some key things in place, and you move to more complexity in terms of governance as you grow. But really, to be successful, you can avoid it. And I guess I'll go back to, so two things can help mitigate that. One, having a great chair, because he can help make sure everyone is staying in their lane. Both management and the board is not overstepping and can back channel and do all sorts of things, but also having an independent. So there's, again, a tendency for all co-founders to want to be on the board and all of this, and that doesn't really help. So reserving space for one or two independents who can help, again, make sure that the interests sort of are not misaligned and is another way to mitigate that concern that you're being held back.
Absolutely. So, as you probably know, we do have a ton more questions. We've definitely run out of time. It was very clear from the conversation that needs to be a series, and I think people in the audience actually agree. Again, first of all, before Ory takes over, I want to say thank you to you, Ory, and thank you to you, Patrice. This time that you've given Future Africa today is really valuable, and we appreciate it. It was tough for us to get this on the cards, but we did, and we made it. We will likely call on you again, because it seems as if there's a lot more that we could possibly be covering. I think the folks in our audience, our founders, investors, we ourselves actually, for the work that we're trying to do on the continent needed. E, thanks for joining us. Love to hear your closing views. You missed a lot of stuff in this conversation. It's been a killer one, really, and we have learned a lot of things.
Thank you very much. First of all, and there's no other person that's a better moderator for this chat than our internal realist, Mayowa. So while the rest of us are content with moving fast and breaking things, Mayowa is always trying to drag us back into the fundamentals and tell us things don't make sense and the math is not mathing. So very grateful to him for anchoring this conversation. Of course, a huge thanks to my big auntie and my big uncle, and some of my other big aunties and big uncles in the audience who I would not call out. But I'm very excited that this conversation is happening, because obviously it's an ecosystem-wide conversation. Quite all right, we're trying to move quickly and build momentum, but at the same time, very much, as Ory said, we have to be thinking long term if we're going to be around for a very long time. And that's what corporate governance can do.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Invest in the Future. You can follow us on all our social media platforms @An African Future to get more insights into the African tech ecosystem.